So this week I have started following one piece of legislation through, which is the schools bill. The schools bill is a classic piece of legislation that illustrates a number of problems with, I think, the way law is made in this country, which is, I watched the TV over the weekend and I heard the Secretary of State, Nadhim Zahawi, talk about how this schools bill will improve standards for children everywhere. And I thought, I must read it. And I thought, what's this got to do with anything that he talked about? One of the things that's fascinating is, if you remember, the great schools revolution of the Conservative Party was that they were going to free up schools from local government authoritarian interventions, allow head teachers to make decisions for themselves, a lot more flexibility with the curriculum. It was the free school revolution, and the academies were going to have let 1,000 flowers bloom. This schools bill does the absolute opposite, which is, it basically says that every single academy should really join a multi-academy trust. When you join a multi-academy trust, you lose your autonomous individual legal status and have to do what the multi-academy trust tells you to do. It might not be a local authority telling you what to do, but somebody is, and you've got no flexibility. And more schools are going to be forced to join multi-academy trusts if they are deemed to be failing schools by Ofsted. There's also a huge amount of power given to the Home Secretary to make decisions about which schools are failing and so on and so forth. Ofsted gets more of a role. That's one bit of the schools bill, and there's a lot more about funding that I can't say I understood. And when I was speaking, I didn't talk about that aspect of it, but I mean, talk about being surrounded by experts. I think 4 people who spoke had been previous education ministers or secretaries of state, so it was kind of the big guns of education in, both from Labour and Conservatives. And it was very much, we the experts know, we knew this would happen, and mocking the Tories with some justification that they had given up on this idea of independence and autonomy. The parts that I concentrated on were about the children not in school, and the emphasis that the government was putting on the problem of increasing numbers of children not going into school, and how they're going to tackle non-attendance, truancy, unregulated homeschool and unregulated schools. To just go through that, I wanted to emphasise that one of the reasons why truancy might be an increasing problem was that we just had a situation where every adult in the country had called for schools to be closed down, which didn't entirely convince lots of young people how important schooling might be. So I was making that point. Homeschooling is not to my taste, I kind of don't understand why you do it, but it's a right of every parent. So basically, every child has to be educated full time, but nobody has to be educated in a school. That's the law of the land. And they're panicking about, well, what's really going on in these homeschools? And the government can say, oh no, we're not doing that, but they want to regulate because they want this register of people not in school. They want to ensure that pupils are having the right kind of education. That really threatens the autonomy of homeschooling, because they want to be able to teach according to the philosophy and outlook of the parents, which they're entitled to do. A lot of kids who were bullied at school or have got educational special needs and can't find an appropriate school are educated at home, and they just do not want councils to now have this register that they come around inspecting. But this is my moral dilemma. They're also targeting, and I think this is probably what the government really wants to target, unregistered schools. Unregistered schools might be, a madrasa, or it might be a school where people from Orthodox Jewish backgrounds are going to schools which they're not registered as schools, and often they're not following any kind of a knowledge-based educational background. They're not registered because they're kind of counted as homeschooling, but it's groups of 10 or 20 in somebody's, in some warehouse or something that somebody's set up. They're not evil or anything, but I know that there's some concern that these kids are not even being taught, not even being literate, and they're not getting any kind of an access to any kind of traditional knowledge. Presumably that's what the government wants to tackle, because I know that they've talked about this in the past. In order to do so, they've kind of encompassed every possible variation and permutation, to the point where they've said, if more than 5 children are gathered together in any kind of homeschooling scenario, Ofsted should be able to inspect, which is going to bring into scope as the language of the law is. Some childminder who might be kind of bringing people together and doing a bit of history teaching or what have you. So this is a real mess. Never mind the fact that I think that allowing the government to keep all this data about children and their parents is very ill thought through. You have to declare, by the way, both parents' details in this in order to not get fined or sanctioned. And as a number of people have rightly pointed out, first of all, some single parents don't want to, maybe don't even know where the second parent is, and just through fault that gap can end up getting into trouble. Some people are the victims of domestic abuse and don't want to put their address in the same address book as the abusing partner. Government haven't thought any of this through, and it's a very centralising bill. So what looks to be a kind of mishmash of odds and sods in this schools bill ends up being quite threatening, but not because anyone's trying to maliciously steal our rights, but because the government's instinct all the time is to use the law to control. And I've said this before, and I think it's very dangerous, and it's ironic that one of the things that's going on is that they say that they're doing a lot of this checking on children for safeguarding reasons, and they're emphasising that the big safeguarding issues are children not in school. And I emphasise, and I continue to emphasise, that there's a lot of safeguarding issues in school. Just to give one mention again to the 18-year-old student who effectively was bullied out of her girls' school because she had the temerity to ask a question of a visiting baroness representing Stonewall, who was going along with gender ideology, and the sixth formers simply asked a question citing some debates that had already happened in the Lords from Hansard, asked a question saying, well, not everybody thinks that, what about this perspective? And then the sixth formers turned on her the next day, and she got bullied out of school, and the teachers abandoned her. She was thrown under the bus, as has been documented in articles in the Times and so on that you will have read. And it's really important to acknowledge that Transgender Trends, the parents' lobby group, have been fantastic in revealing this, and the whistleblowing teacher really deserves credit for coming forward and telling the story of the school. But that's an in-school safeguarding issue the government don't mention, nobody wants to talk about. Instead, it's always behind the closed doors. What are those parents doing with their kids? And I think that's an unpleasant atmosphere for any government to operate in, because it basically implies that the state is more to be trusted in relation to child rearing and child socialisation than parents, and I disagree with that completely. Okay, that's all that. Actually, apart from the schools bill, I've been a bit quiet in the chamber because they have the number of bills that are starting in the Lords, because we're starting this new parliamentary session, are a bit dull. So they've got the procurement bill. I know nothing about that kind of thing. I mean, I think it's all about like PPE procurement, but it's very technical. I wouldn't contribute to anything, so I've kept quiet. Some of the question times I've tried to get in, not get in, but I have decided partly that I'm going to be quite considered about when I'm speaking, and not just kind of like mouthing off, because I would annoy myself doing that. I've also had the opportunity to have some visitors in, which has been really great. A particular shout out to Andy Argyle and Victoria, who came from the northwest when I knew them when I stood as Brexit Party MEP. But Victoria is from Ukraine. They're based in Saltney, and they've been working on fantastic schemes to get equipment into Ukraine. Very inspiring to hear those stories. And I was meant to be giving them a tour of the House of Lords. Of course, I kept getting lost, and it ends up that Andy, typically, because he's this kind of person who really understands things, showed me where the chapel was that I've never been able to find. And I went back there yesterday. I think it's St Mary's Undercroft Chapel. Anyway, it's a special chapel that really access is confined to members of the House of Commons, members of the House of Lords. You can take them with you. It's absolutely beautiful. It's right under the bowels of the Palace of Westminster. I'm going to go back there because I think sometimes it's really nice to just take a bit of time out and sit and think. But I thought it was funny that my guests ended up giving me a tour of the House of Lords rather than the other way around. I wanted to say that I have to comment very briefly on Partygate. only in as much as the Sue Gray report came out yesterday. And, you know, one thing about being in the Lords is we got a copy of the report, you know, properly, which I've read. And I think it was something of a damp squib in terms of the parliamentary comeback. Everybody thought this was going to be the smoking gun, and it certainly isn't. But it did mean that the terraces of the House of Commons last night, when I was meeting some people, were kind of full of journalists and everybody kind of like gossiping and so on. The truth is that I think it's really appropriate to say that when you read the report, nothing can shock you because we'd all known, but I think the one bit shocking thing was the treatment of the noting of the treatment of the cleaners and the staff in number 10. You know, when, you know, we were getting drunk and sick and all the rest of it, they wouldn't let the cleaners have any time off. They were frontline workers too. I think that's all fair enough. I think there's basically, you get the impression of people who are not empathetic to the lives of ordinary people, let's put it that way. But I really want it to stop now because there's just so much else going on. And on that cost of living crisis, I think that, apart from the fact that I know that for a lot of you and a lot of us, there's a real sense in which you feel so out of control. You know, you just feel like, oh my God, we're going to go through this major period of massive inflation, energy prices beyond anyone's capability of paying if you're on any kind of a normal salary, like, you know, 25 grand, which could be all right, but not when you're facing that kind of increase in bills. Also stagflation, all of these big words I don't always understand. I can assure you I never understand inflation properly. I don't really get it. So I did want to say that what we've decided to do at the Academy of Ideas is to hold a meeting on where we've got 3 people who we kind of trust, who are really interesting looking at the economy from the point of view of long-term economic problems, from the point of view of whether there's going to be, you know, trade union action like the RMT going on strike, which might be annoying and irritating if you want to get a train, but let me tell you, they're entitled to do, because a lot of their members are on 24 grand a year, and they're not begging the government to give them a handout. They're basically saying, as a union, we demand that we get, and I think these are perfectly reasonable things. Will that be what happens? What does it mean for the short term in terms of energy crisis? What kind of energy policy should we have? So we're calling a meeting. We're going to do it as a Zoom meeting, so I hope you come along. And it's on June the 28th. Or 29th. I will post it in the message. Sorry that I can't remember, but anyway, at the end of June I'll be back on that. But I do think, like a bit like when I've talked about Ukraine before, which is one of the things that makes these things so frightening, is when you don't have a grasp on what's really happening. And I think if we can, at the Academy of Ideas, provide some explainers, some ideas that go a bit beyond windfall taxes that are short term and we never just grab the headlines, but actually if you divide it between the countries, it's not going to solve anyone's problems, and look a little bit at where we're going and what kind of political positions we should be arguing. I hope that will be of some help to you all. Next week is Whitsun, so we're not in the House of Lords. Everybody's got a week off. I will not be having a week off. I'll be working on building the programme for the Battle of Ideas Festival, but it will be nice to not be in the Lords and to spend a bit of time with people who are not baronesses and barons of the land. But I'll be back the week after.